For human rights reporters and analysts, proper collection of evidence is one of the most important skills that you can learn. Not only for awareness purposes, this evidence can also be used in potential legal proceedings, in asylum cases, and even in fact-finding inquiries. I'm going to give you a quick primer on proper evidence collection techniques, including how to conduct an interview with a victim or a witness of human rights violations. In evidence collection for international criminal courts, there are strict rules that govern the use, the admissibility, and the collection of that evidence. In this context, in a human rights reporting context, we don't have any formal legal framework that binds us. However, it is important to follow best practices in evidence collection, both to ensure the credibility and reliability of the evidence, and also to keep up with best standards in case eventually these case files do go to a formal legal proceeding. There are three principal types of evidence. One is physical evidence. That can be, for example, a bloody rag or something used at the scene of a crime or a human rights violation. A second type of evidence is documentary evidence. That includes documents that evidence human rights abuses or mass crimes, such as court opinions, maybe a letter from a prosecutor to an accused. It can also include photo and video evidence. Photo maybe of somebody torturing a potential victim, video of a shooting of a protester, for example. A third type of evidence is testimonial evidence, and that is one of the most important kinds when you're investigating and reporting on human rights abuses in the Iran context. Most of the evidence that we gather in this field does come from firsthand witness testimony of people who either experienced or witnessed serious human rights violations. In order to be able to gather the best possible evidence from these witnesses, we need to know how to properly interview a witness, put them at ease, get the most truthful and accurate account, and be able to inform them of where this evidence will go at a later stage. And I will cover all that in this session. In the human rights reporting context, we don't have any legal framework binding our collection of evidence and informing us about best practices and highest standards. In different contexts where evidence is gathered to support allegations of mass crimes, such as at the international criminal courts, there's a very strict regime that governs the collection, the use, and the admissibility of this evidence. Here, however, we still do have incentive to follow best practices, both to ensure the credibility and reliability of the evidence, and also to set a certain protocol for the future when and if these human rights violations that we are documenting do actually continue on to form some kind of a legal process in the future. The first step of the interview process is to do your homework. That is, you need to prepare. If you have your witness's name, you should do a public background search to the best of your ability. That can be a simple Google search, for instance. Find out what has been said about the witness that you're going to interview. You want to know what's been said about their account of their time spent in prison or when they were arrested or whatever concerning the human rights violation that's going to be the subject of the interview. And particularly in this day and age of the internet and social media and new media, you'd be surprised how much information you can dig up on your interview subject. So definitely go into the interview prepared. The second step of thinking about the interview process is logistics. Where are you going to have the interview? Location is very important. A lot of times, interviews can be done at a witness's home. However, there's pros and cons to that. The pro would be that they'll feel more comfortable and they'll feel at ease in the setting. The negative side to it could be that they may feel too much at ease and they may be distracted from the one-on-one interview that you will conduct with the witness. Another consideration in the logistics phase is, do you want to bring a second interviewer along? I would recommend doing that, because then they can fill in any of the gaps. When we're conducting very long interviews about human rights abuses, they can last anywhere from 1 hour to 5 hours to 16 hours over the course of 2 days. And sometimes, logically, an interviewer can get tired or could miss something in the narrative. So having the second interviewer next to you to take notes and patch up any gaps in the narrative or to conduct any follow-up is a really great thing. The third step, what do you do when you're finally at the interview? The first thing to do with the witness is to explain the process to them. They should understand what your purpose is, what your mission is, why you are there to speak to them, and what you anticipate will happen with the interview once it's been conducted and finalized. This is the time at which perhaps you want to give them a written consent form so that they're aware in a memorialized fashion of what you expect of them and what's going to come out of this interview. This is also the time when pseudonyms or protective measures should be discussed. Perhaps the witness faces some kind of security threat. You need to discuss whether or not they feel comfortable being completely open or whether they would prefer some degree of anonymity. Now you're going to start the interview. This is the fourth step. Usually you should open up the interview by just asking an open question. Set some kind of rapport with the witness, make them feel at ease, and get comfortable. If you ask an open question, it allows a witness, particularly one who may have never spoken to anybody about these extremely personal and perhaps traumatizing experiences to anyone before, it allows them to open up and get their emotion out. This phase can last anywhere from 5 minutes to, in some cases, even 40, but it's very important to give them the time they need to gather their thoughts, get their emotion out, and be able to give you a short chronological narrative of what happened to them in a summary fashion. After they've answered a sort of open question, you can then ease on to the more specific questions. I think a great way of going about it is by asking open questions like, describe to me, tell me, explain to me. In general, you definitely don't want to ask leading questions, that is, questions that imply the answer to the witness, such as, well, you had a red table in your house at the time of the event, correct? That's the kind of question you want to stay away from. You want to allow them to explain their experiences and give you their account, and you don't want to testify for them. Now, there's different types of witnesses, and one type is a type that's quite easy to explain their story, and they may be, quite comfortable giving you lots of details and talk freely without even you having to follow up on a lot of things. There are other types of witnesses who may be more reluctant to give you a full account of what's happened to them, and you may need to spend a little time asking questions over in a sort of gentle and composed manner to encourage them to speak. However, if it becomes increasingly difficult to get them to answer the questions, the open-ended questions that you're putting to them, you may need to start asking yes or no questions to either confirm or deny different aspects of the story. In general, when you're asking questions, in addition to the open-ended questions, make sure to pay attention to the who, the what, the why, the where, the when, and the most important, how do you know, the basis of knowledge. A lot of times you may be interviewing a witness and they're giving you an account of something, but you don't know where this information has come from. The way that they're presenting it, it seems as if it's their firsthand experience, but it may actually be something that they heard from a brother, from a relative, from a friend. They may have read it in a book. They may have read it online. So it's very important to establish that the source of knowledge is actually their own, because otherwise it's of little evidentiary value in the work that we do. For the who, what, where, and when, and why questions, something like asking them how were the people that came to arrest you? How were they dressed? What car were they driving? where were you taken, who. A lot of times witnesses will say, they came to arrest us or they put us in jail. You need to clarify who the they is. You need to be specific about who alleged perpetrators are so as to establish responsibility and chains of command. And the more detail you get in the interview, the better for the purposes of this kind of collection of evidence. In general, when you're asking questions of the witness, it's good to keep a composed, steady kind of demeanor when you're speaking to them. You don't want to be too animated. You do want to be actively listening and engaged, but you don't want to give any kind of facial cues that could suggest to the witness that you disagree or agree with what they're saying. You want their testimony to come unsolicited and not under any influence from your facial expression or the intonation of your voice. So keep that in mind as you go along. Now comes the challenge phase of the interview. Inevitably, with most interviews, there may be some discrepancy either in the witness's own account or with what the witness is telling you about a specific event or violation that they experienced, and what witness accounts you may have gathered previously, or with something you may have read online or in newspapers. You don't want the witness to get defensive or think that you're accusing them of lying about their account, but you do need to reconcile any contradictions or inconsistencies either within their own testimony or between their testimony and documents externally or the testimony of others. So what I would advise doing is that after you've gone through the sort of chronological narrative and asked the who, what, when, where, why, and how do you know questions, that you put any documents to the witness that you may have that do contradict their account and simply ask them to read the document and clarify or explain why there may be some kind of disconnect between their testimony and what is contained in the documents. Now, when do you end the interview? This is actually one of the most important questions. The most important thing to remember about this is to show the witness respect. For a lot of these people that you're interviewing, they've been through horrific violations of human rights abuses, and this may be the first time they're opening up to somebody outside of their family or their close circle of friends about what they experienced. So give them the time to let them get through their narrative in the pace that they prefer and at the length that they want. However, when you have gotten all the information that you need for your purposes and for your analysis, and when the witness feels that they're okay with ending the interview, that's the time to end it. When you end it, make sure that the interviewee knows what the next step of the process is. If you were interviewing somebody for a formal legal proceeding, you would need to let them know if they're going to be expected at court, what kind of compensation they would receive in terms of travel arrangements, if they need to travel a long distance to get to the legal forum. However, in the human rights reporting context, it is a bit different because it's not yet before some kind of formal legal proceeding. Rather, you would need to let them know if you intend on publishing the interview that you've got with them, if you want to produce a witness statement out of the interview you conducted with them and publish it, and all of that needs to be discussed. Make sure that you also exchange contact information. That may seem really simple, but if you're on mission in another country and you're not sure if you're going to see this witness again, they definitely need to be able to contact you. This will be very important for a follow-up stage. It may be that later interviews that you conduct will either contradict or somehow open new angles in respect to the testimony that you got from this earlier witness. And you're going to need a way to follow up with them, both so that they can review their statement and approve it, but also so that you can clarify on any open-ended aspects that may not have been tied up at the time that you did the initial interview. After you've ended the interview, you need to evaluate what this interview has added to your overall investigation. That may seem like a really basic step, but trust me, when you're in the field and conducting tons of interviews a day, you may not actually stop to think of how this interview fits in the larger picture, or you may put it off for another day. The best thing to do is to do it that very night, the same night that you conducted the interview, when it's still fresh in your memory. Think about how this interview fits in the larger scheme of things. Think about whether it supports or contradicts any previous interviews you've done or any other documentation that you've collected, and then see about how you're going to reconcile that, either with follow-up with other witnesses or further investigation. Just a few quick tips and pointers on assessing credibility of testimony and also taking into account cultural considerations when you're interviewing witnesses who may be from a different culture or for whom there may be some lack of understanding about common concepts. In terms of credibility, if you interview somebody and their account seems almost too precise, they recount dates with a very sharp degree of precision, almost to the hour, and it seems a little too on point, that may be a red flag. It may mean that they have written down their experiences at an earlier date. Maybe they have a journal in which they recorded their experiences right after it happened. You need to ask these questions and establish whether or not they've had some sort of memory refresher to be able to recollect, and maybe they've read that coming into the interview. In respect to credibility, there's also some concerns that can arise if you've interviewed a group of witnesses who've testified about a particular event or a violation that they've experienced, and all the testimony is very similar. Maybe all of them recounted the same patterns of movement of the alleged perpetrator in the same sequence and in the same way, and sort of gave a narrative that was very, very similar. If that happens, then it may be a sign that there's been what we call contamination, which means that these witnesses have spoken to each other about what they experienced and agreed on one common narrative before they've come to talk on you. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be sinister or intentional. It's just that when people have experienced serious human rights violations, of course, there may be a desire and a want to discuss it with one another. But you should just be clear and make sure that you see who they've spoken to about their experiences so that you can be aware of that factor and so that you can consider it in your assessment of the credibility of the testimony. In respect to cultural considerations, many of you who are Iranians who are working in the Iranian human rights field probably think that you won't encounter that many problems in respect to understanding the culture of your interview subject. However, being from the same culture and knowing the context can be both a positive and a negative. On the positive side, it means that you are well placed to assess credibility. You can rigorously test it because you're well familiar with the location and the factual scenarios that the witnesses are putting to you. On the negative side, it also means that you may assume something about the testimony and that any gaps that the witness leaves, you may fill in with your own knowledge. You should be very aware of that and very cautious to not assume anything about the witness's testimony and try to come in with a blank slate as best as you can. Just to give a few quick examples of how there could be some cultural misunderstandings that arise, if you're, there's also an urban and rural divide, for instance. If you're from a city and you're interviewing somebody who's a farmer in a rural area and you ask them about how many persons were at a scene, for example, and they say a lot, please try to clarify as best as possible the number, because to them, 7 may be a lot of people because they work on a farm and have very few neighbors. But to you, obviously, as a city dweller, that would not be a high quantity. So try to keep these relative cultural considerations in mind as you do the interview. On an ending note, remember that an effective interviewer is one who listens more than they speak. You want to stay actively engaged with your witness and listen to what they have to say. You don't want to assume anything about their testimony or supplant it with your ideas of what their experiences have been, and not what you assume they're saying or what you're reading into their testimony.